By the early 14th century, Europe's economic expansion slowed down. This is due to three factors. In Northern Europe, by the end of 13th century, the warm summers of the previous 300 years had given way to bitterly cold summers. If you remember, we had come across uh, the situation where we had studied, I think, in the previous video, where I had mentioned that the climate was comparatively warm in the 11th and 12th century, which really facilitated the growth of crops and the abundant crop growth at that point in time. Because even the countries like Germany and the countries like Austria, which normally were, which we all know are very cold countries, they had comparatively warmer climatic conditions. England, so they, which naturally facilitated farming and crop growth. But this time, those areas again started getting very, very cold, and naturally the crops were difficult to come by. The crops were not that successful as they used to be, as they had been for last 200, 300 years. Seasons for growing crops were reduced by a month, and naturally, students, you have to understand that the time span where you have abundant sunshine, that duration definitely started shrinking, because you now have longer spans for cold winters. Storms and oceanic flooding destroyed many farmsteads. Now, what are farmsteads? Farmlands, right? Where जहाँ पे आप किसानी करते हैं. But farmsteads, that fields, जहाँ पे आप खेत जिसको आप कहते हैं, and जहाँ पे आप फसल उगाते हैं. But farmstead would be a place whereby it's not just the land where you are where you are cultivating crops and plowing and all of that, but it is also a place where you have your houses. You would have it's almost like there would be 10 or 15 houses, farmsteads, 10, 15 large houses where you could be having granary, then you would be having your own houses. It's not that you have a house somewhere else and your land is somewhere else, like it happens in most of the times. Or probably you just have one hut which is there, but one hut would not be known as a farmstead, please. Okay, so you would have a group of homes, and that is known as farmsteads, which resulted in less income and taxes for government. So naturally, when there was a crop failure, the governments couldn't impose taxes, and definitely their economic revenue took a hit. The opportunities offered by favorable climate conditions before the 13th century had led to large-scale reclamation of land of forest and pastures for agriculture. But intensive plowing had exhausted the soil despite the practice of the three-field rotation of crops, because the clearance was not accompanied by proper soil conservation. The shortage of pasturage reduced the number of cattle. The population growth was overstripping resources, and the immediate result was famine. Several famines hit Europe between 1315 and 1317, followed in the 1320s by massive cattle deaths. Guys, essentially it is trying to tell you that because of the comparative warmer climates during those 200, 300 years, a lot of area had been brought under farming. Even the forest land had been brought under farming. Many trees had been chopped so that the farming land could be expanded. Okay, but you have to understand that when the crops are bountiful, then your animals also have plentiful to eat around them. There are a lot of grasses, and there's a lot of crops and all that. So there was no scarcity of food for them. But once the crops started failing and you have those many animals, now where would they go to feed? Because they don't have much to eat now as well, because humans themselves found it difficult to barely meet their requirements. So naturally the animals got neglected, and many cattle started dying at that point in time, because there wasn't much for them to even eat. Because now you had a situation where you had huge tract of land under farming, but there was nothing growing there. So it was all barren land. So you can understand how would the animals survive now. The worst was yet to come. in addition, trade was hit by severe shortages of metal money because of the shortfall in the output of silver mines in Austria and Serbia. This forced governments to reduce the silver content of the currency and to mix it with cheaper metals. The worst was yet to come. As trade expanded in the 13th and 14th centuries, the ships carrying goods from distant countries had started arriving in European ports. Along with the ships came rats, carrying the deadly bubonic plague infection. Guys, that is what it is. If you ask someone in Missouri from say 1970, someone who was there in 1970, or even for that matter in the early 1980s, he would tell. Good morning, students. We've been looking at the chapter of three orders, and also in it, we've been looking at the transformation of European society. We saw that, or rather, we discussed that in the 11th and the 12th century, there was a very conducive environment climatically for the growth of bumper harvest and the crops. So everyone was making money, everyone was prosperous, but because of the warmer temperatures, of course, in those areas, in those geographies. But by 14th century, they got unlucky, and the European marshland and the areas and the European geography in the European continent again started becoming very, very cold, which led to the failure of in huge amount of crops, and also the fact that for the first time Europe was confronting the problem of plague, because the increased trade also brought about increased trade naturally led to a huge amount of traveling through ships into different corners of the world. And when those ships were coming, or the new goods were coming from those distant lands, they were bringing rats with them, and along with the rats came plague, which killed millions of citizens in Europe. So that is what we saw yesterday. Today we look into the problem of social unrest. So what we now see is that the European society was suddenly grappling with trouble from all the sides. Okay, whether it was natural, whether it was the disease, and now we are talking about the social unrest, that is the problems naturally within the society. The income of lords was thus badly hit because people were gone, there was a disease, the crops had failed, so it was obvious that the income of the manorial class was surely badly hit. It declined as agricultural prices came down and wages of laborers increased. In desperation, they tried to give up the money contracts they had entered into and revive labor services. Essentially, what they are trying to do, trying to tell you, is that systems change with passing times, because we saw in 10th century that the laborers, the peasants, did not have any rights. They just had to live within the campuses. They did not know about the world outside, and so they were completely dependent on the nobility, and under very, very poor living conditions. But we also saw that gradually the towns started coming up, the urbanization started, and many young people started moving outside these manorial states, started settling in those areas. So they started experiencing the world outside, and this was bound to this was bound to broaden their horizons. And now what started happening within these states was that rather than just an arrangement of whatever you grow, you that was the food item you get in return, and some loose change for your survival. The rights of people went up because they started growing more and more crops. Naturally, they also were being now paid properly by the class of nobility. But suddenly, after a period when they were being affected by the failure of crops and the plague, the disease, the nobility now wanted to bring back, rather change the arrangements and bring back the time which existed in the 10th century and the 11th century, where the peasants were completely dependent on the nobility. That is, they just did the labor without expecting anything in return, and the nobility did not have to pay much to the people. But then you have to understand that 300 years had already passed from that arrangement, and now people were in no mood to actually go back to those, again, times of hardship and subjugation. So there was a huge amount of protest. Okay, although these rebellions were ruthlessly crushed, because, students, you remember I had told you one very important thing which nobility had, and something which the new middle class and the new rich class, the new trading class, which was prospering because of its trade around the globe, that they did not have one thing which the nobility had, and that one thing was the control over army. They had their own soldiers, right? And the and the nobility, which of course they could see that the other segments of population were also making money, and they had started becoming affluent, but nobility held its control over the army very, very strongly. And when the problem erupted, they had their army to take care of this problem, and naturally the rebellion was crushed. But despite the severe repression, the sheer intensity of peasant opposition ensured that the old feudal relations could not be reimposed, because now the times had changed, as we just said, and there was no going back to those times of 10th century. So political changes. Okay, political changes. Development in the political sphere paralleled social processes. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European kings strengthened their military and financial power. The powerful new states they created were as significant for Europe as the economic changes that were occurring. Historians have therefore called these kings the new monarchs. Louis XI in France, Maximilian in Austria, Henry VII in England, and Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain were absolutist rulers who started the process of organizing standing armies, a permanent bureaucracy, and national taxation, and in Spain and Portugal began to play a role in Europe's expansion overseas. Now, students, what started happening here was the fact that now they were families. Students, you have to understand that a particular family has been in rule for 2 centuries, 3 centuries, 4 centuries, 5 centuries. Now they have amassed enormous amount of wealth and resources, and now it is obvious, and they have a huge standing army of their own. It is obvious that now they've become ambitious. Now they want to see the world, not just see the world for conducting trade, but also to colonize them, because the traders had given a sufficient amount of information to them about the great world that existed, and the prosperous world that existed outside Europe, and these now European families wanted to have their stake in those countries and those geographies and those continents. And particularly, if you in the coming chapters you would see that Spain and Portugal played a huge amount of role in the colonization of Latin America. Uh, in fact, if you look into the some of the earliest explorers of the naval explorers of the modern history, they all come from Portugal and Spain and England and France. That these are the places they come from, because this was a time when they were actually, this was a time of Christopher Columbus, this was a time of Bougainville, some of the greatest naval explorers of all time, and they had started venturing outside the Mediterranean Sea. Now they had started venturing into Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, all the different parts of the world, because now they wanted to see what was the world that they lived in, and if they could broaden their, because Europe was a small place. right? Europe was a small place. It was not as big as the world that they used to see in Asia or Africa or Americas, for that matter. Europe was comparatively very, very small. Now it was big. Now it was particularly for them at this point in time. It was very small for to accommodate their ambitions. Okay. So the most important reason for the triumph of these monarchies were the social changes which had taken place in the 12th and 13th century. The dissolution of the feudal system of lordship and vassalage and the slow rate of economic growth had given the first opportunity to kings to increase their control over their powerful and not so powerful subjects. The rulers dispensed with the system of feudal levies for their armies and introduced professionally trained infantry equipped with guns and siege artillery, because now it was not just about they were just not maintaining just some few hundred young men to just to maintain that sense of security, but if someone attacks, and then they would, because these were not defensive armies anymore, because now the European family, these families, these rulers had enormous amount of wealth and resources now, so their armies would not be defensive armies anymore. Their armies had gradually started becoming attacking armies. So even if they did not perceive a threat from somewhere, they would still be interested in attacking their opponents and taking away whatever their opponents had, because now their idea was to become more and more prosperous and wealthy and powerful. And by increasing taxes, the monarchs not just got enough revenues to support larger armies, and thus defended and expanded their frontiers and overcame internal resistance to royal authority. Centralization, however, did not occur without resistance from the aristocracy. A common thread running through all types of opposition to the monarchies was the question of taxation. In England, rebellions occurred and were put down in 1497, 1536, 1547, 1549, and 1553. In France, Louis XI had to wage a long struggle against the dukes and the princes. Lesser nobles, however, often members of local assemblies, resisted this royal usurpation of their powers. The religious wars in France in the 16th century were in part a contest between royal privileges and regional liberties. So essentially, what we are looking at is that the growing ambition of the ruling families of Europe was not at all welcomed by all the segments of the society. There was a great segment and a segment within the European society which did not quite appreciate all this expansionist approach to which gradually they had started, the ruling families had started embracing. They did not like this at all, because now it was always the growth of army, the militarization was that gave an alibi to the ruling families to keep increasing the taxes, because they wanted better armies, expanding. They wanted to expand their military forces, buy more arms, manufacture more arms, better horses, all of that, and naturally all this war and bigger ships for venturing into distant lands. All this costs money, and where would the money come from? Naturally, as from the people, in form of the taxes that were collected. So naturally, the town councillors would never appreciate all of this, because they were never going to be the ultimate beneficiary, because whatever money would be looted and plundered from distant land would ultimately go to the royal families, to the rulers. The normal people and the common people would not be the beneficiaries at all. Thank you. Good morning, students. In this chapter of three orders, which I think we should be able to finish today, we have seen how the aristocracy and the social structure in the European society was being transformed and being changed in 10th, 11th, and 12th, and 13th, and 14th centuries. Right? It started with it started with the noble families being absolutist in their approach. Then we reached a situation where we had the manorial states, where the peasants and the poor and the vassals who used to work there in the land. And we also saw that there was no option but to work in agriculture, because that was the thing where which that was the industry rather which employed 95% of the population, and that was the industry which gave 95% of the revenues or earnings to, for that matter, to any kingdom. And because of that we also see strengths. But you have to understand one very important thing, that the important thing is the land might remain constant, right? The area of land under cultivation, the methods of cultivation, the seasons, they might all remain constant. But you have to understand one most important thing, that is the people who work on that piece of land, that is the humans. We keep changing all the time. Our mentalities keep changing. uh, our thinkings evolve. Our place in the society, we are very class conscious people. Even a rickshawala happens to be a class conscious people. Students never ever assume that he doesn't have a self respect, or he is not conscious about being insulted or being not being given adequate respect even within his own community. It is not just people like you and I who can speak and understand English and probably go to fancy places to eat and eat in fashionable dresses. We are the only ones who have self-respect. So this was also the problem, rather, if I may put it that way, for the nobles in the 11th and 12th centuries, because the hundreds and thousands of farmers and the peasants and the vassals who used to work in those states, their thinking had started changing. They wanted more from life. They wanted more from for themselves, their family, their wives, their children. They wanted more from it, and it was getting difficult for the nobles to actually catch up with them and to meet all those aspirations. And this is the reason why you also saw that many of them started, especially the younger generation, started migrating from those states, the manorial states, to the towns, which have started evolving and developing during those times. And you have to understand that in those times a town of 30,000 or 40,000 people would be considered a large town. And that is why you read somewhere in the chapter that if a person who had escaped from his of the manorial state, and if he could stay hidden for more than a year and a day, he could actually be declared and considered free to mind his own business, live the life he wanted to. So that was now fueling a huge amount of population increase in those areas. Then we also saw that there was now the time was coming where everyone was not involved in growing and farming, whereby either you were growing crops or vegetables or fruits. Now, no, you were now also engaged in different kinds of economic activities. If you were living in town, people now started taking up trading. People now started opening up shops, which was naturally making them, I wouldn't say rich, but then definitely their economic status was improving. So, because of this, it was bound to have the whole social equation was bound to undergo change. And this is what we have been studying, and this is the reason why the peasants definitely they remained peasants, but then definitely their status was improving, their economic condition was improving, and with that their thinking was changing. And it was now the nobles found it not as easy as it used to be at some point in time. But one thing which the nobles had, which the peasants could never, was the fact that the kings and the king and the nobles, they had the control over the army. Ultimately the army belonged to the king. Okay, and gradually we saw that the kings now started having permanent armies for themselves. Earlier it used to be outsourced to different nobles, and when at the time of danger those nobles had to contribute a certain contingent depending on the population that they had. But now the kings started having permanent armies, so naturally that gave them enormous amount of power. Something which a trader or something which a farmer, a peasant, or whatever, even if he is not very satisfied with the things around him, he could never be able to stand up to that, because the kings used to have their armies and the administration with them. Okay. So the nobility managed a tactic, and the nobles, if you remember, they started kind of coming on their own, and then they started asserting their influence on the king, because they felt that yes, they were the ones who were contributing the maximum amount of riches to the king. But then, as we just saw, that because the kings controlled army, the nobles also understood it is no point trying to go for a fight with the king and his ministers, because they are the ones who control the army, and if the person who might is right. So the nobility managed a tactical shift in order to ensure their survival. From being opponents to the new regimes, they quickly transformed themselves into loyalists. And it is for this reason that royal absolutism has been called a modified form of feudalism, precisely the same class of people who had been rulers in the feudal system. The lords continued to dominate the political scene. They were given permanent positions in the administrative services, but the new regimes were different in important ways. So now the nobles understood that there's no point trying to be smart, so they fell in line, and kings naturally rewarded them, because the kings also wanted their support, because king would not be going to one manorial state to another manorial state and manage the peasants. Ultimately, it was being managed by the nobles themselves. So kings did need their support. They could not antagonize all the nobles at the same time, otherwise it would become very difficult for the king to survive himself. So he definitely needed the support of the nobles, and those nobles who fell in line, they were not that they were punished, that कि आप इतने दिन कहाँ थे, आप तो बहुत बड़े हो गए, sort of. They were very, very generously rewarded. And the king was no longer, but let's see, another change that was brewing in was that the king was no longer at the apex of the pyramid, where loyalty had been a matter of personal dependence and trust. He was now at the center of an elaborate courtier society and a network of patron-client relationships. All monarchies, weak or powerful, needed the cooperation of those who could command authority. Patronage became the means of ensuring such cooperation, and patronage could be given or obtained by means of money. Therefore, money became an important way in which non aristocratic elements like merchants and bankers could gain access to the court. They lent money to the kings, who used it to pay the wages of soldiers. Rulers thus made space for non-feudal elements in the state system. So we are now seeing that now there was the reign of kings who were absolutist monarchs, जो कहा वही होगा. That thing had gradually now start changing, whereby different institutions within the state, different institutions within the kingdom, they start government institutions, that is, they started coming up, they started becoming more influential, they started becoming more powerful. So it was not that the king could do whatever he wished. He had to listen to the people and the institutions that had now been evolving around him. The later history of France and England was to be shaped by these changes in the power structures. In the reign of Child King Louis XIII of France in 1614, a meeting was held of the French consultative assembly known as the States General, with three houses to represent the three states: order, clergy, nobility, and the rest. After this, it was not summoned again for nearly 2 centuries, till 1789, because the kings did not want to share power with the three orders. What happened in England was very different. And mind you, students, till 1789, even in 1789, when the King Louis XVI actually summoned this assembly, it was only because he wanted to increase the taxes, for which he needed the support and consent of the States General. That is why he had to call it, because he could not. That's what we are talking about now. He could not do it unilaterally. कि मन किया तो खुद कर दिया. No, now he needed the support of the institutions, which the state institutions. So things had been evolving, things had been changing. Now, what happened in England was very different. Even before the Norman conquest, the Anglo-Saxons had a great council which the king had to consult before imposing any tax. This developed into what was called the Parliament, which consisted of the House of Lords, the members of which were lords and the clergy, and the House of Commons, representing towns and rural areas. King Charles I ruled for 11 years, 1629-40, without calling Parliament. When he was forced to call it because he needed money, a section of Parliament decided to go to war against him and later executed him and established a republic. However, this did not last long, and monarchy was restored, but on the condition that Parliament would be called regularly. Today, France has a republican form of government and England has a monarchy. This is because of the different directions that the histories of the two countries took after the 17th century, because it is obvious that France had a revolution in 1789 against the tyranny and oppression of the ruling society of France. And that is why no one wanted to hear about monarchy again after Napoleon and after 1840 and 1850. But yes, England, they had their rulers who had long stint. Elizabeth, then George the Eighth, and I'm sorry, Henry the Eighth and George the Sixth. All these rulers, they had long reigns and they could survive because they understood that you could not be now a complete absolutist ruler, and the British kings started working more and more with the Parliament of England, which consisted of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But France did not have any such structure, and their ruling family had been, the reputation of their ruling family had been tarnished, especially after the French Revolution. Thank you, students.